The two contenders for French president have now emerged. For the first time, they won't come from either of the main parties. So what will this mean for the runoff vote in May? Macron is the favourite, but what could a Le Pen presidency look like? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine. Now, the first round of the French presidential election is over. Now, centrist Emmanuel Macron takes on far-right Marine Le Pen in the runoff election in 2 weeks' time. But this election is about more than just liberal versus conservative. It's about being for or against the establishment, immigration, the European Union and globalisation. So what would a Le Pen victory mean for France and the world, politically, socially and economically? What about a Macron win? We'll get to our guests in just a moment. First, David Chater has this report.
Day one of the real campaign. Marine Le Pen at a farmer's market in northern France. And she came out fighting against Emmanuel Macron, the man all the polls suggest will easily beat her in the race to the Élysée Palace.
He is an hysterical, radical Europeanist. He is for total open borders. He says there is no such thing as French culture. There is not one domain where he shows 1 ounce of patriotism.
It was a message heard loud and clear in her stronghold of Beaumont, where she won 46% of the vote, an 11% increase on the figures in 2012.
Inside Marine Le Pen's electorate, you'll find retired men and women, labourers and unemployed entrepreneurs, France in general, whereas Macron's voters represent privileged France. Marine voters are the people.
It's in these old industrial heartlands of France that have seen nothing but decay, decline and stubborn unemployment. The Marine Le Pen's vision for the country has gained most traction amongst the voters.
This map shows how the country is divided between the two candidates heading for the runoff on May the 7th. Macron dominating in the west, with Le Pen capturing the north and the south. The businessmen and brokers in Paris this morning were putting their money on Macron. The euro was surging hand in hand with the stock market. The 39-year-old former investment banker is pro-Europe and a convinced backer of globalisation.
My fellow French citizens, you did it. You are the face of French hope. The face I want to see win in 2 weeks. There is only one France, our France. The France of patriots in a Europe will have to rebuild.
He celebrated after topping the polls in a Parisian restaurant on the left bank, famous for being a haunt of the author Ernest Hemingway, as well as philosophers and artists who were known as part of the caviar left.
His program is actually going to decimate the working class here in France and put more competition between working classes from, of course, the broader white Christian majority and the rest of the population.
Macron might have claimed victory, but his total vote count was the lowest score of any first-round winner since 2002. His real challenge will be to gain some political muscle in the National Assembly elections in June. The National Front is already claiming it could gain up to 40 seats. That would really change the face of French politics. David Chater, Pas-de-Calais, Inside Story.
Right, let's introduce our guests now. In Paris, we have Dominic Thomas, chairman of the Department of French Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. In Rouen, in France, joining us on Skype, Laura Slimani. She's a city councillor there and a former president of the Young Socialist Party in France. And in London, we have Matthew Goodwin, Professor of Politics and International Relations at the University of Kent. Welcome to you all. Laura, can I start with you? What happened to the socialist vote? It pretty much collapsed.
Well, you had a very unprecedented situation where we actually had a very legitimate candidate, Benoît Hamon, who was chosen by a primary process. But then a lot of the people who actually were part of the primary decided to abandon this candidate in order to support another candidate, Emmanuel Macron. So I think this played a big role in the collapse of this vote, or at least in the significant division of this vote, which in the end, was split between Benoît Hamon, Emmanuel Macron, and to a certain extent also Mélenchon. So I think, there's a lot of factors that explain it. But
right. But Manuel Valls, the former Prime Minister under President Hollande, of course, went to Twitter and tweeted that the Socialists are in a phase of decomposition, demolition and deconstruction. I mean, that means the left is over pretty much in France for now at least.
I think he has a big part in it, if I may say that. And I think that everyone as himself who actually, when in government, didn't stand up for the traditional values of the socialists and of the left, and who didn't stand up for social progress, quite the contrary, actually have a big responsibility in the state of the left. But it doesn't mean that the left doesn't exist in France. I mean, if you add the scores of all the left-wing candidates, you actually have a pretty strong political group. And so the question for us and for the future is, how do we unite this progressive alternative to the far right and to the current system? Because I don't believe that Emmanuel Macron can embody that change.
All right. Dominic, coming to you, where does this mood, this swing against the established political class, where does it come from?
Right. Well, I think that over the years what we've seen is a blurring of the left-right divide. And whereas the generation of parents and grandparents had voted traditionally and for a very long time along traditional party lines, in the 59-year history of the Fifth Republic, this is the first time that a mainstream political party is not left in the second round, or will not be there fighting for election. What's so interesting is that if at one particular time the right was considered the party of law and order, and the left traditionally was known as the party of movement, we've seen over the years candidates emerge from different political factions, so that it's not so easy to identify with them in this particular way. What we saw in the election this time around was interesting, because the Républicains on the right held primaries for the first time, and the Socialists only held these primaries for the second time. And we're seeing that a kind of attempt to sort of consolidate a kind of establishment status quo by doing that. And of course, at the moment at which candidates like Emmanuel Macron, Mélenchon did not participate on the left, and that Marine Le Pen went alone, it was sort of open for this kind of outcome to happen. We see it, in other places. The Dutch elections that took place in March saw the Labour Party go from being the second most important party to the seventh political party. So I think that people are looking for transformations and are frustrated with the establishment. And I think in the case of the Socialists, the 5-year presidency of François Hollande, at the moment at which François Hollande was not going to run as a candidate, I think that anybody who was ultimately selected by the Socialists in that primary was doomed to failure. And I think it's important to point out that Jean-Luc Mélenchon scored 3 times higher than the Socialist candidate. So there's some real issues here, and one finds oneself at a crossroads, indeed in the same way that the Labour Party in Britain does, or that the Democratic Party does. The left needs to rethink its focus and its agenda.
Indeed, Dominic, thank you very much, because I was going to go to Matthew in London and ask if there are parallels elsewhere, particularly I'm thinking of London, which of course itself is gearing up for another general election in 5 weeks from now, where we have the left in a state of disarray.
Well, indeed, Britain is on course for the 4th major electoral contest in 3 years, after the Scottish referendum in 2014, the 2015 general election, the EU referendum, and now another national general election. And the story throughout all of those contests has been the decline in support for what you might call the traditional progressive left, whether in terms of voting for Brexit, or whether now in terms of the almost total collapse of the Labour Party. We have some polling just over the last 48 hours here in the UK, which puts the Labour Party on 23% of the vote, which, if repeated at the election in June, would put the Labour Party on its worst showing since 1918. So we are seeing a real problem on the left, and I would suggest that that is really structural, as the previous guest has just said. You know, the issue here is about a deep structural shift within social democracy. It's now relying on two completely irreconcilable groups of voters: blue-collar workers and the new middle-class professionals, and they think fundamentally differently about these issues.
All right, and Laura, in France, if this mood is sustained, this mood of a backlash, if you like, against the political establishment and propelling these figures to the forefront, we have Macron and we have Le Pen, who stands to benefit the most come May the 7th? Well, first of all, I'm not sure how valid this analysis of the establishment is. If you look at the facts, the facts are that if you want if there is only one candidate that is from the establishment, it is Emmanuel Macron. From the political establishment, if you look at the fact that he was supported by people from the two different main political families in France and main figures, Manuel Valls, former prime minister, Gérard Collomb, the president of the Modem, one of the big center-right parties. So he was supported by a lot of the main big political figures. But Laura, I mean, he started a movement. He didn't really start a political party, and it's only been a year in existence. He started a movement in order to bring him to power, but I doubt that this movement will live after him. And I think that's one of the issues. I'm just pointing out the fact that we have a bit of a paradoxical situation here, and that when Benoît Hamon was actually much more anti-establishment in the proposals that he made and in the content that he presented to voters, he indeed is the one who actually suffered from this rejection of the establishment. But also, I think it's true from the failure of the 5 years of government. And regarding the 7th of May, I don't think anyone will benefit from this situation. We have Marine Le Pen, which is scoring the highest score of the National Front ever in France, and it's a dramatic situation. And in front of her, you have a candidate who wants more liberal globalization, more liberalization of the labor market, more public spending cuts, which we know are some of the reasons why the far right is so high at the moment, not only in France. Okay, Laura, I want to take those points and elaborate on them a little bit, because Macron and Le Pen, as you've heard, they stand at opposite ends of the political spectrum. Le Pen wants to leave the European Union. She's promised to hold a referendum if she's elected. Macron, he wants greater integration with the EU. Le Pen says she'll maintain France's 35-hour working week, while Macron insists he'll give companies more power over working hours. And on the issue of immigration, Le Pen wants to limit entry to 10,000 immigrants a year. Macron, on the other hand, has said Europe needs to get used to the new era of unstoppable mass migration. And security, of course, has been a major concern. At least 230 people have been killed in France in a series of attacks over the past 2 years. And this was the first time the French voted under a state of emergency, which has been in place since November 2015. And Dominic, coming to you in Paris, so the campaign is already underway, and Marine Le Pen has come out swinging her club, and she's had a go at Macron, accusing him of being weak on the issue of national security. How far is this issue of national security likely to determine who wins on May the 7th?
Right. Well, from the very beginning, a lot of the voting and a lot of the deciding and a lot of the sort of strategizing over who one votes for, this is yet again, and it's part of the frustration, going back at least to 2002, when people are going to the polls and not so much voting for a candidate with whom they ultimately embrace, but strategically voting against an alternative and against a vision. So the actual political platforms of the candidates, of course, vary on specific issues, whether they be security or the environment or employment hours. But ultimately what one is selecting is a vision for France. The vision of Marine Le Pen is anchored in a protectionist, nationalist, what some have called an ethno-nationalist kind of agenda. In the last debate, she promised to return to France their keys to the economy, to the borders and so on. It is a closed Brexit, Trump-like vision of the world that is going to do very little to enhance morale. Having said that, her party and the rising popularity of this party and its deep impregnation in regional communities and so on point to the fact that there are deep, deep fractures in French society, and candidates going to the second round of this election are going to have to demonstrate that their solutions are going to address these particular problems. I think in the case of Marine Le Pen, it's about fear-mongering, it's about xenophobia, and I'm not sure that people are going to go down the road and embrace that. What's interesting is that in those areas that have been most impacted by what you've just pointed out, such as terror attacks and so on, those are not the areas that vote for Marine Le Pen, in the same way that the areas in Britain that are often the least diverse, the least multicultural, or that have received the least number of migrants and so on, were the most inclined to vote for Brexit and so on. So Emmanuel Macron can't solve all of these problems, but the fact is France is here trying to move in a new kind of direction and a new way of trying to think about these particular problems and issues.
All right,
and I
Dominic.
think the popularity of both Mélenchon and Marine Le Pen speak to that.
I can see Matthew shaking his head there. Matthew, you wanted to come in there?
Well, no, I think it's important that we understand the relationship between migration, immigration, and support for populism. And if you look at the Brexit vote, we actually did a report on this for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, showing that the support for Brexit was highest in areas that had experienced the most rapid demographic change over the preceding 10 years, areas that had received the largest number of EU nationals. And that's really important because what that tells us is that there is a section of European electorates, a not insignificant section, that is deeply anxious over the effects of ethnic change and how their communities are changing. And, you know, Macron, in a way, is right when he says that Europe is only going to experience increasing rates of diversity. But he's also, I think, wrong to dismiss that concern as simply fear-mongering and xenophobia. It is perfectly legitimate for some citizens, particularly those on low incomes, to feel deeply anxious about how their countries are changing and how they're sometimes left out of the job market. What I worry about with Macron is as Laura was suggesting earlier on, if you look at his programme, I think a few years from now, we will see, as we did in 2014, very vocal protests, sometimes rioting, as we saw 3 years ago, against the proposed economic reforms, which ultimately are about liberalising the French economy, which are not going to give the kinds of protection to French workers that many of them are wanting to see in this globalised world.
And Laura, as the recent president of the Young Socialists, I ask you about this issue of having a job, because with 10% unemployment in France, you can double that figure, no doubt, for the youth population of France. Therefore, how resonant is the message from Marine Le Pen in that it's basically France first? I mean, very similar to the Trump message, but hers is obviously France first. Is that really having resonance with the young people that you come into contact with?
Yes, of course. I think, you know, this is part of it, and indeed the situation, the economic situation of young people, and especially the fact that society, basically there is this feeling that society doesn't really care for this new generation. One of the examples is that young people under 25, for instance, do not have access to the minimum social protection in France, even though they are the ones most touched by poverty. And that's you know, one of the many injustices, that generational injustices that young people feel. But I think that Marine Le Pen also appeals to young people in a different way, in a way that is linked to the fact that, you know, the rejection of the system, of the current elites, the current political elites, which we have to say, and yes, we have to say it honestly, there have been a lot of political corruption scandals in the past years from the right and from the left, and this and the privilege also of a lot of the elites, I think, has also fueled a lot of the support for Marine Le Pen, very unfairly, obviously, because her party is actually the one where you have most convictions of their elected representatives for fraud and for corruption. But, you know, this is where young people look. And I think that the European issue is crucial in the debate that we have. And this is one of the big problems and issues that Emmanuel Macron will have to face in this debate, in this 2 weeks debate. It's, you know, I don't think there is a way forward, and it is a winning strategy to pretend that Europe is great as it is now. We know it's not. We know there are issues. We know that we need to tackle these issues. We need Europe to become a space of social progress. Otherwise, if we keep the status quo like Emmanuel Macron seems to be wanting, then it will collapse. And then people will keep fighting against Europe, and it will make the far right rise even more. So I think that one of the big changes he has to make is his position on Europe.
All right, Dominic, from the German perspective, for instance, and German representing the anchor, if you like, of the European project, the nightmare scenario would be a Le Pen presidency.
Right, absolutely a nightmare president. Just to go back very quickly to what Matthew was saying, I completely agree with that. I had in mind cities like Glasgow that had welcomed, Syrian refugees and so on. So I just wanted to be clear that I'm not thinking that differently from him. Absolutely, when it comes to the European Union, if one just goes back and looks at videos, for example, of Donald Tusk on the day that Article 50 was triggered and Great Britain was leaving, and he was asked to comment on that, he looked like he was chewing limes and lemons. The last thing the European Union needs is to have attention focusing away from the particular issues and struggles it has on another divorce from the European Union, especially in terms of a country like France, that's one of the inner 6 founding members. That conversation, that energy and that time and effort put into that would be absolutely devastating. The European Union, I think, recognizes, or at least needs to take into account the fact that there are deep problems in Europe, that there are several Europes, and that there are several Europes within the nation states that will make up the EU 27 once the United Kingdom has left. And it would be better off focusing on these kinds of issues, and also to remind people and educate people on what the values of the European Union are, particularly at a time when so many European states are confronted with the question of terror, diversity and migration, and the confusion about how these terms are being utilized by the political establishment.
And Matthew, what about a possible Le Pen presidency, and how that would relate to Washington? Marine Le Pen has been seen cozying up to President Putin, and she's spoken openly about the possibility of lifting sanctions on Russia over the annexation of Crimea.
Well, sure. I mean, she's spoken about that. I do think when we talk about a President Le Pen, we are entering into the realm of fantasy politics. I really, I look at the numbers daily. I just cannot see a way that she gets up to 50% across the second line. But let's imagine for a second, that she does. I think one of the really interesting aspects, one is about that alliance between Europe's populist nationalists with Russia and their links with people like Steve Bannon and so on in the White House. And, from their point of view, they see the world order in a completely different way. They want to push back against what they would call the liberal dominance, and they want to start reasserting the powers of the nation state, whether that's against international organizations, like the IMF and the World Bank, or whether it's against the EU more regionally. But, there's an interesting aspect about Le Pen. Let me just quickly finish on this. Here's my theory about Le Pen. I think she went too far on the anti-Euro stance in this presidential election, because if she does become president, the first thing that's going to happen is there's going to be a run on the euro, and people will start trying to get euros out of the banks in France as quickly as possible, and before long there'll be capital controls, and they'll be capped at 60 euros a day like the Greeks were. And essentially, let's be frank,
all right,
if Marine Le Pen wins a presidency, it's the end of the Eurozone.
All right. So Laura, can I put it to you then that given this scenario, that basically all of the political establishment is likely to rally round together to support Macron in order to make sure that Marine Le Pen doesn't make it into the Elysee Palace, pretty much like they did in 2002 when her father got round to the second round?
Well, I mean, I think everyone is legitimate to do it, but I also think that actually there's a risk in showing that the whole establishment is trying to back up Macron, because ultimately I think that's making Marine Le Pen's case even stronger. So I think we have to be careful with that. And the second thing is I believe that it shows that there is no alternative to the system in what Macron is proposing. He's proposing the perpetuation of the current economic and political system. And this is why we have to work from day 2 after the election, and after we make sure that Marine Le Pen doesn't get into power, on what kind of future we want for the left and how we can make sure that the left can reposition itself as an alternative to the current system. I think it's true for France, but it's true for a lot of countries in Europe and also in the US.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you all very much indeed. Dominic Thomas, Laura Slimani and Matthew Goodwin, thank you all very much. And thank you, as usual, for watching. You can see the programme again anytime you like by going to the website, aljazeera.com. If you want more discussion, go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter, our handle @AJ Inside Story. From me, Martine Dennis, and the whole team here in Doha, it's bye for now.